I'm Don Hillman, a retired professor from Michigan State University. This is the second part of my presentation, and I'll repeat that during my retirement I have assisted farmers in over 100 stray voltage cases and have studied electricity extensively. Electricity is a blessing to mankind when carefully managed and when its effects on the body are understood and respected. But like alcohol, drugs, and tobacco, when electricity is not properly controlled or people are overexposed, electricity can cause human and animal health problems. In 2003 and 2004, I studied effects of uncontrolled electricity, electrical pollution, in homes, schools, and workplaces in East Lansing and other places in Michigan. What's in our homes? We commonly have dirty electricity riding on a clean 60 Hz waveform, as we saw earlier. This waveform was photographed from a home in Berkeley, California by Dr. Martin Graham, electrical engineer, University of California. Nextel had installed a cellular telephone station in the water tower at Patriarch Park near our home about 4 years earlier. When neighbors received notice that Nextel had applied to City Council to expand their telephone generator and transmission station in the park, residents near the park became concerned about possible impacts on health of families in the neighborhood. I had studied Barry Kennedy's new book, Power Quality Primer, and learned that switch-mode AC-DC power transformers produce a lot of transients and harmonics that are dumped onto the neutral wire of the utility power supply. Then it travels on the ground wire to other customers and is grounded to the water pipes in the park and in homes, schools, and workplaces. I decided to measure the voltage, the current, amperes, and frequency, hertz, of electricity on the ground wire from the Nextel cell phone installation in the city park. I used a Fluke oscilloscope and recorded the readings on my laptop computer. You will notice the Lansing Board of Water and Light's three-phase transformers and the single-phase electric service for Nextel are located near the water tower in Patriarch Park. The voltage, current, and frequency on Nextel's ground wire were exactly as Barry Kennedy had described. The Nextel reading shows that AC voltage, DC voltage, and peak-to-peak voltage increased each time the cell phone generator started and could be heard roaring from my recording position in the park. The Nextel waveform from the ground wire shows a large bite had been taken from the peak of the waveform. This was as Kennedy had described. Switch-mode power supplies take their energy from the peak of the waveform. This is a classic example of Kennedy's prediction and is a distorted waveform. This is the frequency spectrum resulting from the previous Nextel distorted waveform. Our frequency spectrum is an array of electrical signals oscillating at different cycles per second. The Nextel spectrum supplied a rich source of second, third, and fifth harmonics. As mentioned earlier, a harmonic is a multiple integer, a whole number, of the fundamental 60 Hz, the first harmonic. The second harmonic is 120 Hz, the third is 180 Hz. Total harmonic distortion is a measure of dirty electricity, or Ph.d. Ph.d. was recorded on phase or supply lines and utility ground wire at our home for 24 hours by Lansing Board of Water and Light. Ph.d. was 40 to 80% on phase wires during some periods of the day. Ph.d. was 200%, almost consistently, on the utility ground wire bonded to water pipes. Ph.d. exceeded IEEE 519/1992 standard, which limits Ph.d. to 5% of total harmonic distortion and 3% from any one frequency. IEEE is considered the ultimate authority about electricity in the United States. The magnetic field at the ground wire and water pipes was recorded in our home by Lansing Board of Water and Light engineers. The magnetic field, EMF, averaged 97 milligauss for 24 hours, plus or minus a standard deviation of 39 milligauss. The maximum was 320 milligauss. Exposure of children to greater than 1 milligauss increased lymphoma cancer in a Danish study, according to Dr. Olson in the British Medical Journal in 1993. This is a frequency spectrum analysis. High frequencies account for the high amperage and total harmonic distortion on the ground wire and water lines. The spectrum analysis shows 2200 milliamps from peak to peak high frequency current on the water line. Frequencies ranged up to 124 megahertz or million. Total harmonic distortion was 4,022% and accounts for high electric and magnetic fields. These photos describe the EMF on the ground wire in my home. The ground wire is under the living room floor and radiating up to 320 milligauss or wireless electric and magnetic fields into the air. EMF recorded on our living room floor ranged from 20 to 50 milligauss. That was about a foot above the ground wire. EMF averaged about 30 milligauss during this 35-minute experiment. EMF induced 2.4 to 5.4 amperes of current through my body. The current was driven by a 118 to 288 millivolts of electrical pressure from the magnetic field on the living room floor. EMF increased my heart rate and blood pressure. Heart rate increased from 60 to 82 beats per minute, 29%. Systolic blood pressure increased from 127 to 140, or 14%. Diastolic blood pressure increased from 70 to 104 millimeters of mercury, plus 48%. This discovery concurs with more than a dozen published reports. We found many published reports of effects of EMF on heart rate, blood pressure, ventricular fibrillation, heart rhythm, and hypertensive heart disease. The list is only a beginning. The central nervous system, endocrine stress. Hormonal responses associated with EFM exposure were described. The studies were conducted in occupational exposures and laboratory settings and reported in credible scientific journals. Somehow, they escaped the public's attention and have not been included in general practice medical training until now. Would you want to know if damage to your heart is at risk because of your electrical exposure? High blood pressure. Hypertension has become a national epidemic, according to the American Heart Association. Blood pressure is increasing at all ages, 20 to 80 years. Heart rate and blood pressure increased in proportion to EMF exposure in the East Lansing study, which was repeated 5 times. I had been sleeping in this declining chair for several years because I couldn't sleep lying flat in bed. The chair was located near the center line of the magnetic field in the living room. Exposure in the chair was 4 to 8 milligauss on the surface. Cushion springs in the chair were acting as antenna and gathering radio frequency 98.5 megahertz electric currents. These currents were electrical eddies dancing in the chair. Eddies were also dancing in Mary's Betty. Do you have eddies in your Betty? Hazardous contact current was measured at the kitchen sink with the oscilloscope. The recordings correspond with the high current on the water pipes connected to the ground wire in the basement. The distorted 60 Hz waveform was measured from the sink, using the floor as the ground lead to complete the circuit, recording 3.28 volts. That's where my wife stands, washing dishes and cooking. Current on the sink was 355 times more than the Electric Power Research Institute and the National Institute of Environmental Health report to have a biological effect with respect to cancer. EMF in the living room concurs with voltage on the ground wire and bathtub in a study by Cavett et al., 2005, published in Bioelectromagnetics. The solid line in this chart is voltage in the bathtub. The broken line is voltage on the water line. The dotted line is the magnetic field in the living room. All go up or down according to volts on the water line. Data were for 6 days in the same house, thanks to Dr. Cavett of EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. Lansing Board of Water and Light removed most of the EMF from our ground wire one step at a time. They disconnected the power supply. EMF was still there. They moved the ground wire on the water pipe. EMF was still there. They installed ground rods outside. EMF was still there. They installed a dielectric union in the water pipe. Success. EMF was gone. The dielectric union is a rubber insulated coupling that goes into the water pipe. This oscilloscope reading shows high frequency current on our neighbor's water line. The distorted waveform is composed of 624 millivolts and 3.2 amperes peak-to-peak current on the water line. The lady in this house was diagnosed with a fibrillating heart and now has a pacemaker. This frequency spectrum, the blue bars, shows a large amount of current associated with 1.58 to 58.46 megahertz radio frequency current at another neighbor's home. These are not 60 hertz power line signals, they are radio waves. The lady in this house has non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which has been associated with exposure to electric fields among electrical workers at Ontario Hydro in Canada and children in Denmark. The lower chart shows 1.8 amperes of current recorded from the water line. Cleary's water line is on King Court, only 78 feet from the Nextel cell phone transmitter and water tower in the park. The frequency spectrum shows 2238% total harmonic distortion. The distortion is associated with 4.1 to 41 kilohertz radio frequency signals. One of the neighbors living here has MS. The other had a pacemaker, which had to be replaced with a defibrillator. What's in our schools? High-frequency electromagnetic fields and electrical outlets were in schools in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Canada, and in East Lansing, Michigan. Power density ranges from 120 watts per square meter at 30 meters to 23 watts at 400 meters from the cell phone tower. Power density was 60 watts per meter at the school, 110 meters from the tower. Cellular phone signals overlap communication cables, adding to pollution. Medical authorities in Nyland, Germany, found that people who lived within 400 meters of a cell phone tower had 3.4 times more cancer, and patients died 8.5 years earlier than those who lived more than 400 meters from the tower. Measurements were taken at St. Thomas Aquinas School water line in East Lansing. The water line carried 2.2 amperes current as shown on this waveform. The frequency spectrum shows 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 9th harmonics. The total harmonic distortion is 43.9% and exceeds the IEEE limit of 5%. These measurements were taken at Marble School at Hagedorn and Bircham in East Lansing, Michigan. The communication wire running down the pole is radiating 65 milligauss of EMF. Safe exposure is less than 3 milligauss. This reading is 6 inches from the sidewalk where children wait for the street crossing guard. Power density was 80 watts per meter under the power line at the same location and 75 watts per meter at the school door across the street the same day. Laboratory animals chronically exposed to 5 watts per meter develop 4 times more cancer of the thyroid, pituitary, and adrenal glands than controls not exposed to EMF. That was 20 times less than FCC standards in 1985. 63 to 107 volts were radiating from these 46 kilovolt transmission lines recently installed between a farmer's grain storage and barn above this driveway. The electric current was 8 kilovolts per meter, and the magnetic field was 4.5 milligauss at head level under the wire. The electromagnetic field induced 80 millivolts of electrical pressure and induced 8 amperes of current through the subject's body while standing under the transmission line. That was sufficient to stimulate ventricular fibrillation and cause hypertensive heart disease in the farmer subject within a year. 30 years ago, the right-of-way was for a single line. Now the utility has installed 3 lines, refusing to consider the farmer's offer for free right-of-way if the utility would choose another route away from the barnyard. Other alternatives were not even considered. Rights of eminent domain seem to have been abused. Do all rights belong to the utilities, none to property owners? It is interesting to note that this poster was produced by the U.S. Department of Labor, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Region 7. It is also interesting to note that the farmer just mentioned was told by a Consumers Power representative that he should warn anyone who has a pacemaker not to walk under the wiring between his shed and barn. OSHA, Occupational Health and Safety Administration, directives are for less than 1 milliamp exposure for protection of the unprotected public, and standards for protecting employees from electrical hazards are enforced in the industry, but do not apply to private premises. Why? Electric current induced onto the sheet metal siding and door of the building was 5 to 7 volts and induced 1.6 amperes through Mr. Chick's body when he touched the building when opening and closing the door. The 46 kilovolt transmission lines were erected 13 feet from the building. Current and voltage were measured under the 46 kV lines and at 100-foot intervals away from the lines. Current exceeded the 5 milliampere threshold level for ventricular fibrillation of the heart at every location for 600 feet from the transmission lines on the Chick farm. There is no place to hide from excessive exposure to EMF. Signals from cellular telephone towers were also evident on the test wire and in the home. A policy of prudent avoidance regarding unnecessary risk of EMF exposure when siting transmission lines has been endorsed by the World Health Organization. Prudent avoidance in siting of power lines by utilities could reduce health risks, avoid much suffering, and dramatically reduce medical costs and eliminate litigation and mitigation costs. In the Netherlands, Tennet, operator and administrator of the National High Voltage Grid, is developing a transmission system that would dramatically reduce magnetic field radiation from transmission lines. They recognize the problem, and the government is preparing new and stricter ordinances. The man on the right is hypersensitive to electricity. He can locate electrical hotspots because his nervous system is sensitive to small amounts of electricity. Some hypersensitive people become nauseated. He gets stomach contractions causing him to belch. Others suffer headaches, muscle pains, dizziness, or vertigo when near electrical lines, computers, television, and cell phones or cell phone towers. Some develop a skin rash when near electrical lines, computers, televisions, telephones, or cell phone towers. Government health authorities of Sweden and the United Kingdom of Great Britain acknowledge electrical sensitivity as a physical impairment of humans and offer medical treatment programs to victims. They estimate about 1/3 of the population is electro-hypersensitive. American doctors are likely to recommend a psychiatrist and put you and the school children on Ritalin or other drugs. EMF signals stimulate peripheral nerves, which are monitored by the central nervous system, that is, the brain and the spinal cord, and stimulate the pituitary glands to release hormones to control essentially all functions of the body through the adrenal glands, thyroid glands, testes, ovaries, and lymphatic system of the bone marrow and blood. Because chronic electroneuroendocrine stress influences cortisol, and cortisol influences heart rate, blood pressure, blood glucose, electrolytes, and the immune system, chronic excessive exposure to electric and magnetic fields can result in hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, proliferation of cancers of the blood and lymphatic system,
and susceptibility to allergies and infectious diseases.
Effects of chronic stress on cortisol and body functions are well defined in modern human physiology textbooks. After prolonged stress, the reactions may be reversed, and adrenal fatigue results, as in Addison's disease. The seriousness of exposure may depend on the genetic makeup of the individual as well as the intensity of electrical exposure. In preliminary studies, blood sugar of a diabetic increased in proportion to voltage of high-frequency currents measured from electrical outlets in the home of a diabetic.
Also, blood sugar decreased, and insulin required was reduced when high-frequency filters were plugged into the outlets of a diabetic's home, according to Dr. Havas in Ontario, Canada, and Dave Stetzer in Wisconsin.
Other studies have shown that insulin secretion is attenuated when pancreatic cells are exposed to EMF. Dr. George Carlo managed a $28.5 million research project funded by the cellular telephone industry. Investigators found that cell phone radiation disrupted cardiac pacemakers, compromised the blood-brain barrier, and inflicted genetic damage that is a known diagnostic marker for cancer. Cancer among cell phone users had doubled in just 6 years compared to the general population, according to his book. His book is Cell Phones: Invisible Hazards of the Wireless Age. His work convinced the insurance agency to cancel product liability coverage for EMF radiation cases of cell phone companies. The National Electric Safety Code in 1997, Rule 92, states, under normal conditions there will be no objectionable flow of current over the grounding conductor. Utilities often violate the NSC standards. Is causing heart, ventricular fibrillation, and muscle spasms objectionable? The National Electric Safety Code Handbook states the word objectionable is undefined in the NSC. It is left up to the designer's discretion. Areas that are often known to present specific problems are milking barns, pipelines, conduits, etc. No mention is made of the living room, the kitchen sink, the bathtub, shocking swimming pool, shocking shower, and so on. Rule 215B objects to use of current as part of a supply conductor from both safety and service standpoints. NESC says we may need special attention to limit damage to equipment or uncomfortable conditions for personnel and animals. In the Handbook for Assessment of Management of Magnetic Fields Caused by Distribution Lines, Electric Power Research Institute states, furthermore, proximity to distribution lines has been associated with the risk of childhood cancer in 3 epidemiological studies.
A 2006 study in Japan reported 4.7 times greater risk of acute lymphoblastic leukemia among children whose bedrooms had magnetic field levels of 0.4 microtesla compared to children in bedrooms with less than 0.1 microtesla. That was by Kubota in Japan.
Copies of the paper-bound handbook are available to non-members for $25,000 each. Chronic diseases are increasing in the USA, according to the Lansing State Journal and the Associated Press reports. The chart on the left shows high blood pressure increased 13 million cases between 1987 and 2001. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and high cholesterol are the major chronic diseases, accounting for 75% of the $1.57 trillion health cost in 2003. EMF as a possible cause of chronic diseases is not mentioned.
Electronic communication investors and promoters are adding 130 megahertz internet signals to electric power supplies and posting internet transmission boxes throughout neighborhoods. Available information indicates they are trespassing on private property without permission and creating a health nuisance. Where is the proof that their magnetic waves are harmless? Who is monitoring the health effects? My dairy farmers would be put in jail if they put contaminated milk on the market.
New discoveries provide new opportunities for research, development, and employment to correct or mitigate previous mistakes or misunderstandings. EMF research is essential. Funds are limited. Bias must be eliminated. Universities are dependent on outside money, corporate grants, which result in patents, royalties, salaries, and promotions. Principal sources of funding are industrial, drug and pharmaceutical industries, and electronics industries for colleges of medicine and engineering. This seems to be creating priority conflicts between prevention and treatment, and perhaps biasing the data. 5 or more sources of EMF exposure have been identified. The ground wire and ground currents flowing through homes, schools, workplaces, and the earth. Overhead communication cables, which also enter homes, schools, and workplaces. Overhead transmission and distribution lines. Electrical and electronic appliances and office equipment, and wireless communication towers. Many EMF measuring instruments are available at prices from $100 to $30,000 and can be found on the internet. Mitigating devices include plug-in filters, dielectric insulated coupling for the water line, and shielded neutral isolation transformers. Each has a specific use. Thousands of EMF peer-reviewed articles are published in scientific journals, yet nothing appears in the public press or information media. The general public is kept unaware of EMF health risks. Government and education institutions, universities, colleges, public schools, and service agencies ignore EMF hazards. Information media avoid announcements of EMF effects on human and animal health. Utilities are responsible to inform customers of health risks and remove dangerous EMF. Fluke Corporation is a maker of electrical measurement instruments. In a service bulletin, Fluke advised its customers, troubleshooting power harmonics. If transformers are overheating, neutral conductors are overheating, circuit breakers are tripping, and standard troubleshooting shows no problem, in a word, harmonics are the likely cause, and that's paraphrased. A voltmeter is not sufficient to detect harmonic problems. A power quality instrument is needed to determine frequencies. How often does your computer throw you out? Practice healthy electronic hygiene. You must learn what appliances are most likely to be harmful and avoid getting too close, just as you would avoid sitting on a hot stove or touching an ugly dog. You can purchase a simple meter to check the EMF at various locations. Install the necessary mitigation devices as recommended. You can purchase electrical protective clothing, suits, socks, and shoes now available to utility employees who work at electrical jobs to minimize exposure. This one is by KK Guard in Ohio. Perhaps the school system will furnish them as they do handheld computers, football uniforms, and so on. Promote safe EMF environmental legislation. Contact U.S. senators and congressmen, state legislators, administrators, and the Public Service Commission. Stop PSC utility coupling. Stop politics over public health. Stop profit and position over people's health. I am grateful for the extraordinary effort of my colleagues listed here, and also to Mark Farron for assisting in editing the script.